You may have noticed somebody who might be slightly familiar to you the last couple of nights, me, on a History Channel documentary about George Washington. And I mention that only to say my work in that field previous to coming here to the World War II Museum is how I got to meet Charlie Neimeyer. Prior to coming to Quantico, Virginia, Neimeyer had held various academic titles, including former Dean of Academics at the U.S. Naval War College and Forrest Sherman Chair of Public Diplomacy in Newport, Rhode Island. Neimeyer has also written works based on the American Revolution, my former field, and edited a volume published by the U.S. Naval Institute in 2008 titled On the Corps, USMC Wisdom from the Pages of Leatherneck's Marine Corps Gazette and Proceedings. He's also author of some other books, including America Goes to War, A Social History of the Continental Army, and Charlie told me the publishers made him put the word social in that title. He didn't initially want to put it there. And then War in the Chesapeake, the British campaigns to control the Bay, 1813 to 1814. So please welcome Dr. Charles Neimeyer.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It's wonderful to see everybody out and to talk about Iwo Jima, one of my favorite topics. And I was a director of history for the Marine Corps for 11 years, and there was never a day that went by, perhaps even sometimes several times a day, where I didn't get a question about this particular battle. And I have to tell you this funny story because you may have been hearing in the news in recent years about the confusion about who actually raises the flag on Mount Suribachi on D+4 at Iwo Jima. And it took us 3 boards, I was on 2 of them, to figure out, we think, who actually is on top of Suribachi raising that flag. But I used to say to people, I said, well, to tell you how bad it is, I had a file on Iwo Jima, and I had 66 Marines from World War II that claimed they raised that flag. And I said, well, there only 6 of you can really be in this shot, but they were convinced. And it's very similar to the kissing sailor. There's 100 guys that say they were the guy, there were 100 women that say they were the nurse, but somebody was, obviously, but we're not really sure who. But in this case, we think we finally got that underhand. So we take pride in being accurate at the History Division. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about Operation Detachment. This is what I call one of the touchstone battles for the Marine Corps. There's 3 battles that what I say kind of defines the Marine Corps, even to this very day. The Marine Corps is very deep in its tradition and its history. And the first is Belleau Wood in 1918. The second is Iwo Jima in 1945. And the third is Chosin Reservoir in 1950. So those 3 battles, when you think about the Marines, they think about them too, and they think about them all the time. So the intensity for this particular battle was significant. It was probably the toughest fight the Marines are ever going to have in World War II. It was way tougher than any of the earlier fights, Guadalcanal and Tarawa included. This battle alone was one of the few battles in the Pacific where the Marine total casualties were going to exceed that of the enemy, the Japanese. The Marines are going to lose over 22,000 killed and wounded, obviously mostly wounded, but 6,800 Marines killed in action at Iwo Jima, 6,800 during the 36 days of fighting. The Japanese are going to lose about 20,000, 19,000 of them will be killed. So one of the few battles where the Marines are going to lose more. And it's also famous for the famous flag-raising photograph by Joe Rosenthal. It becomes the iconic black and white photo that is one of the most famous combat photos in the war. But Iwo Jima is considered a seminal event for both the photo and what took place after the flag was raised, because the flag is raised on D+4, and there's 32 more days of heavy fighting ahead. So if you were in one of those Marine regiments ashore and you saw the flag go up over Suribachi, you noted it and you were happy about it, but it did not mean that the war was going to end for you that day. In fact, we took many, many more casualties as a result of that in record time. So This is the island itself of Iwo Jima. It's a pork chop-shaped island, and it's dominated by Mount Suribachi on the end. You can see it in the lower side of the picture there. Mount Suribachi is a dormant volcano that rises about 800 feet above the landing beaches. So when you're going ashore and you're looking over to your left, you know the Japanese are looking right down your throat. But the interesting thing about Suribachi was the Japanese did not plan to heavily defend that mountain because they knew it would probably get cut off. You can see the very narrow neck there that's at the bottom of the picture there. The Marines were going to drive across the island the very first day, and they're going to cut Suribachi off. So Kuribayashi, the Japanese general that was going to defend Suribachi with his troops, they are going to put about 1,500 of his troops on the top of that mountain or in that mountain, and the rest are going to be upward towards the airfields and towards Kitano Point in the north part of the island. So Iwo Jima is going to be a battle that was a tremendously violent and casualty-intense affair from start to finish. In fact, Captain Fred Haynes, who later became a major general, who I got to know while I was on active duty, told me that death came from every single direction. There was no rear, there was no side, there was no front. It didn't matter where you were. You could get shot in the back, you could get shot in the head, and there was no way you're going to avoid getting hit in this particular fight. Now, before this battle occurs, one of the things that they're going to have to do is plan the attack. And these are 4th Marine Division planners getting ready to go to war. One of those guys in that picture is Major General Clifton Cates. Clifton Bledsoe Cates. General Cates wins an award for gallantry in combat at every rank, from the rank of 2nd lieutenant through the rank of Major General. He's going to become the Commandant of the Marine Corps at the end of World War II. He's going to replace General Vandegrift. He's going to be the Commandant during Korea. And General Cates is going to have the Navy Cross at Belleau Wood as a 2nd lieutenant. He actually got shot in the head by a German sniper. It dented his helmet but didn't penetrate it, knocked him unconscious for 15 minutes. He revived himself and put himself back into action and took a town called Beresches from the Germans. So they said, this guy's pretty tough. We might as well keep him around. And he was. But one of the things the Navy has to do is they have to provide support to the Marines. And Marines don't go anywhere without the United States Navy. So it's important we remember the Navy is a major component of the Navy Marine Corps team. And as I used to tell my Marine friends at Quantico, while we think we're pretty good at what we do, we've yet to learn how to walk on water. So that's not going to happen. All right, so the Marine Corps and the Navy are going to beat up Iwo Jima starting in June of 1944. The United States Navy is going to have a task force called Task Force 58. It's commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance. He was the great victor at the Battle of Midway. And Task Force 58 is the sword of the Republic. It's a striking force that the Japanese have no answer to. It has 12 aircraft carriers. It has 30 battleships. It has cruisers. It has destroyers. It has an amphibious corps attached to it. Task Force 58 is invincible by 1944 in the Western Pacific, and the Japanese know it. Now, Raymond Spruance sees a big picture compared to, say, General H.M. Smith, who just sees Iwo Jima as the target. Raymond Spruance says, we got to not only attack Iwo Jima, but we also have to attack the Japanese mainland with Task Force 58. And therein is going to start the first argument between the Marines and the Navy over the preparations of getting ashore at Iwo Jima. And this is how it went. General H.M. Smith was the senior Marine in the Western Pacific. His nickname, H.M., stood for Howling Mad. Okay? And he really was a painful guy to deal with. And Spruance, of course, is a very, very buttoned-down Navy officer, knew what he was doing. And Spruance says, well, I'm going to take the battleships, and I'm going to take the carriers, and I'm going to raid the mainland of Japan while you Marines are going ashore at Iwo Jima. And H.M. Smith says, well, we're going to get the naval gunfire support. We need those battleships in the line. He says, well, we're going to need them to protect the carriers, and we'll come back after we get done the raid. But so Smith says, he said he was never more depressed in all of his life. He said he had to haggle like horse traders, trading lives for ammunition. And he finally convinced the Navy to get some of the old World War II battleships that had sunk at Pearl Harbor, like the USS Nevada, USS Tennessee, the park offshore of Iwo Jima, to help with the naval gunfire support as the Marines went ashore on 19 February. So that's an important thing to remember, is that the Marines wanted 10 days of naval gunfire bombardment. 10 days. They got 3. And H.M. Smith thought that was not enough. Now, in hindsight, as an historian, I can tell you that I'm not sure that 10 days would have mattered anyway. They were so deep dug in. They used to say that there were 20,000 Japanese defenders on the island of Iwo Jima. They weren't just on it, they were in it. Miles and miles of tunnels that they had been working on for a year and a half. They had bunkers and pillboxes that if you hit it with a direct hit from a naval gun, it probably, unless they were standing in the cave entrance or they were standing in the front of the position, they would not even known about it. They were so deep inside that island. And they were tough to get out of there. So the Marines are going to have a tough time. And as you can see, here's Smith and this guy, Richmond Kelly Turner. His nickname was Terrible Turner. Both of these guys, for whatever reason, they were both irascible guys, but they seemed to get along with each other, which I've never yet figured out as an historian. It's like H.M. Smith and Turner ticked off everybody in the Navy hierarchy except each other. I don't know why they worked well together. I guess because they were of the same mind. But tough guys to get along with, but they were pretty good at what they did. They were amphibious warfare experts of the highest order. So why Iwo? Why did we have to take Iwo Jima? What was so important about Iwo? Well, if you look on the map, and we'll see some maps a little bit later, Iwo Jima, the Bonin Islands, are located literally one halfway between the Marianas, which we had taken in 1944, and the main islands of Japan, Honshu, which is the big main island where Tokyo is located. It's one halfway. And the Japanese had 2 airfields. They were building a 3rd one, and they were putting fighter squadrons on those airfields. And so the idea was when our B-29s were going to raids against the Japanese cities from the Marianas, Japanese from the airfields at Iwo Jima would come up and intercept them. And so it was a 16-hour round-trip flight from Tinian and Guam to Honshu. So the airmen were in the air for a long period of time, and a lot of things can go wrong, and a lot of these crews were lost. So the idea was if we take the Bonin Islands, we can basically take out their radar installations, which warns the mainland that the raids are coming, but can also increase the attacks because now again, fighter support all the way to the target and back. And that's why they want to take Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is not going to be an emergency airfield. Some people would say that. It can serve as that, but it really was a way station for fighters. They're going to put fighters, their P-51s, as soon as they can. In fact, before the battle's even over, there's P-51 squadrons flying off those airfields. So this guy is the guy they're going to be facing. His name is Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He is a kind of an interesting guy. He also is a very traditional Japanese general. He's tough, he's uncompromising. He drives his men mercilessly for the year he's on the island prior to the Marines' arrival to get the island ready for an attack. He does not expect to survive the battle. He writes the letters to his wife and he says so. He says, I don't expect to come home, so don't look for me. But on the other hand, he is kind of a defensive genius, and he reverses what the Japanese traditionally did in the war. The Japanese would typically, like they did at Saipan and other places, they would launch banzai attacks, and they were usually pretty futile, and the Marines would chew them up, and it would usually be a prelude to us winning the battle. In this case, he says, banzai attacks are strictly forbidden. Every soldier of the Empire of Japan is ordered to kill 10 Americans for every one of you. Make your fighting position your tomb. And he was serious. And so the whole idea was to run the casualties up. The Japanese had lost faith that they could win this war offensively by this time. They said the only way we can convince the Americans to not invade the home islands is if we make these landings so horrific for the Americans, they will never think about coming ashore on the Japanese home islands. So this is the new strategy. It is a die-hard strategy, and he's going to enforce it ruthlessly, and he does so. Okay, so his plans are built around a lot of his Army and Navy units, and Kuribayashi is going to basically kind of plan this out very meticulously. He's not going to defend Suribachi, as I said. He also is going to heavily use anti-personnel mines. For the very first time, the Marines are going to run into anti-personnel mines and anti-tank mines on the beaches as they made the landings. And there's a lot of casualties, and we're going to see some in a minute, of Marines that didn't realize how bad it was going to be. But Kuribayashi uses ceramic landmines. They're made out of pottery. Now, why would that be difficult? Well, if you have a metal landmine, you can run a mine detector over the top of it, and you can figure out where they are. With a ceramic mine, you get a probe for it with a bayonet or a K-bar. And a lot of times, if you make a mistake, you set them off. And a lot of Marines lost their lives because they couldn't find where these mines were at. And Kuribayashi had everything worked out. Interlocking fields of fire. He had indirect fire systems. He also waits for the buildup on the beaches, which is so insidious. The first hour of the landing at Iwo Jima, there was hardly any fighting. In fact, there's some rounds coming in, there's some machine guns going on, there's some shooting, but it's not the heaviness that it's going to build up to just an hour later. He waits for 3 or 4 waves to get ashore. They're stacked up on the beach. The Marines said that digging a foxhole in the sand of Iwo Jima was trying to dig a hole in a barrel of wheat. Every time you dug it, it just filled in, and so there was no cover. So Kuribayashi waited for all these Marines to pile up on the beach, and then he'd let them have it with indirect fire systems, mortars, artillery, machine guns, snipers, and everything he had right on the beach, and there was nowhere for you to go. There was no cover, there was no concealment, and he chewed up the Marines on the beach pretty badly. About 2,000 of the 6,800 killed in action are going to occur on just 2 days, on D-Day and D+1 of the Battle of Okinawa. Again, the statistics are there. The Japanese had a lot of indirect fire weapon systems. They would build them typically in the reverse slope of hills and mountains. Now, why is that important? Well, they did it because naval gunfire, which was very effective in World War II, a naval gun is a flat trajectory weapon. It fires a flat round. It can blast something on the front side of a hill. It's not so good in indirect fire, hitting something on the backside of a hill. So if you put your weapon systems on the reverse slope, they can survive a naval gunfire barrage, which the Japanese figured out. Kuribayashi figured this out, and it worked for him. Marine order of battle, they're going to have 2 divisions go ashore on D-Day. 5th Division on the left, 4th Division on the right. The 3rd Marine Division is going to be in floating reserve. It's going to be held into the rear, but they're going to have to get to the reserve almost immediately because they're going to be running out of guys very quickly, very quickly. In fact, I did some research on who serves in Iwo Jima, and we had a number of casualty cards. We have all the World War II casualty cards for the Marines at my division we had at Quantico. And we would have guys that were getting researched by their relatives, and they would say, well, I'm not sure what unit they were in, but my grandfather and my uncle and my dad was killed in Iwo, and I'd like to know who they were with. And I would look them up, and they weren't with any unit. They were a replacement draft, and they got killed before they even got assigned to a division. That's how bad it was. They would just shove these guys in there and said, go up to the 9th Marine Regiment, and they wouldn't make it. And so they would be killed, but they would be members of the 30th replacement draft. I said, I don't know what happened to them after they landed. And it was that bad. So that's how the casualties were. It was pretty bad. This is the assault. You can see the Marines going ashore. You see Suribachi looming off to your left. It's pretty bad. 800 feet straight up, and they're looking right down your throat. Fortunately for the Marines, the Japanese don't have many on top of the mountain. They're mainly at the base of the mountain. U.S. Navy moves in with destroyers, 5-inch guns, firing rapid fire into the faces of those caves, and they take out a lot of the Japanese as they attempt to come out to fight the Marines. So it's a pretty tough fight from start to finish. And the first couple of assault waves, they don't do so bad, but as you'll see, it's the follow-on waves that get chewed up pretty badly on D-Day. Here's the beach itself. One of the problems they had on the beach is that the day of the landing, the surf was relatively calm, but as the day went on, the surf got worse and worse. The beaches were so cluttered that the Navy beach party and the beach masters there had to use explosives to blow up these vehicles to make lanes so that the follow-on crews could land supplies and equipment. So it was pretty bad for them to be able to get in and figure out how do we get over this junk that's piled up on the beach, not to mention the casualties. One Marine said that there were so many casualties rolling around in the surf and also on the beach. It was very similar to Omaha Beach in many ways, that the Marines were hesitant to bring any more vehicles in because they were just running over bodies with it, and they didn't want to do that. So this beach was littered with junk and casualties and everything else, and it made just chaotic times for the Marines just getting ashore. The black sand and the terrace. You can see the Marines moving up on the black sand right there. They had a tough time with this sand. And to this very day, it's still there. The black sand is interesting. Anytime we have Marines that go over for a visit to they have a reunion of honor there. They're going to have one again this year on the 75th anniversary. They bring back jars of sand. It's like a holy relic when they bring it back. I used to tell them, I said, if you bring back the sand, it's a big deal. And they do. And the sand is important because every single veteran I talked to from the battle told me that sand was just so obnoxious. It got into everything. It got into your weapon. It got into your clothes. You couldn't dig a foxhole in it. It just was awful, and you couldn't move in it. Even the infantry had a hard time getting up on the top of that terrace. But again, remember now, they're raining mortars down on you, machine guns, and indirect fire at the same time. There was a lot of violence on the beach. Robert Sherrod, who had been with the assault waves during the exceptionally bloody Battle for Tarawa in 1943, was no stranger to combat. And he said this. He said, the sloping sands were spotted with American dead. Here and there were dead Japanese, but it was apparent that the enemy had not defended his island from the beach. He depended mostly on his mortars, artillery, and hillside machine guns. Whether the dead were Japanese or Americans, they have one thing in common. They died with the greatest possible violence. Nowhere in the Pacific War had I seen such badly mangled bodies. Many were cut squarely in half. Arms and legs lay 50 feet from any body. In one spot on the sand, far from the nearest cluster of dead, I saw a string of guts 15 feet long. Only the legs were easy to identify. If they were Japanese, if they were wrapped in khaki puttees. American, if they were covered by canvas leggings. The smell of burning flesh was heavy in some of the areas. Now, Robert Sherrod had gone ashore with the American assault waves at Tarawa in 1943, and he said Iwo Jima was way worse than Tarawa, which was considered to be a bloodbath for the Marine Corps in 1943. So that tells you how bad it was. So casualties on the 4th and 5th Divisions continued to mount. So the Marines would say that combat on Iwo devolved into a series of relentless frontal assaults against dug-in Japanese defenses. The Marines usually only discovered Japanese locations when they drew fire from them. That's how they found them. They would be moving forward, somebody would shoot at them, and they would have figured out that's where the Japanese were at. And we would have occasion after occasion where people would believe that, I couldn't believe the Japanese got this close. One of my favorite persons from the battle was Jacqueline Lucas, Private Jacqueline Lucas. And I saw his picture here in the museum today. And Jacqueline Lucas, amazing guy, he lied about his age to get in the Marine Corps. Very young. He was 17 years old when he's going to receive his Medal of Honor. He's going to get it on D+2. But Lucas gets the Medal of Honor, and he tells a story. He says that he was in a trench or a fighting hole with a couple of his squad mates, and these Japanese soldiers popped up literally 5 feet directly in front of them. They had no idea they were there. And Lucas had his M1. He shot one of the Japanese soldiers, and his M1 jammed. So he's looking down to try to unjam his M1 rifle, and because he saw another Japanese soldier roll 2 grenades into their hole, right next to his squad automatic rifleman, a guy named Alan Croson. So Lucas yells grenade, takes his rifle butt, jams one of the grenades into the sand with the rifle butt, throws his body on the other grenade, and the grenade goes off underneath him, and he survives. Incredibly survives. At age 17, the youngest Marine to win the Medal of Honor in the history of the Marine Corps. So it's an amazing, amazing story. Suribachi. Suribachi is going to be taken by D+4, and it dominates everything. One of the things that most of the veterans would tell me when I did the interviews with them was that it was a psychological thing with them. This thing was just staring down their throat the whole fight. God, they knew the Japanese were up there looking at them, and what do we do about it? So they wanted to take it. So the 28th Marines, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division, the spearhead is going to take Suribachi. And their job is to get up there and take it out. So what they're going to do is they're going to basically take it on D+4, and they're going to raise some flags. And we're going to talk about that in a second here because the flag raising is important. Okay? Again, here's the terrain again. Pretty bad terrain. It's no cover. You can see no trees. It's all open terrain. Shell holes you're covering. That's about it. Okay, the constant combat, you can see these guys, they're shooting, and by the way, they're still fighting. These are artillerymen and guys getting ready to go up on Suribachi. And of course, we have general officers, they're in the front lines. This is Graves B. Erskine. He's the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Division. He's right up there in the front. There was no rear area. Erskine was shot out all the time. Interesting to note about all the generals that were in charge of the Marines at Iwo Jima. I did some background checks on all these guys that were there. Graves B. Erskine being one, H.M. Smith being another, Clifton Cates being another. All those generals that were in charge of Marines at Iwo Jima had survived the hell of Belleau Wood. Isn't that interesting? all of them had been at France at Belleau Wood. I used to ask my Marines, I say, well, how bad was Belleau Wood? Well, we lost so many casualties at Belleau Wood in World War I that it was equal to the number of casualties the Marines had lost since 1775. That's how bad it was. They lost 50% casualties at Belleau Wood. So the bloodletting at Belleau Wood, the violence of the combat, prepared these generals for what they were going to face at Iwo Jima, and it worked out in their favor because of that. So they are going to be fighting it out with the Japanese, ridge by ridge, hole by hole, and they're going to use something called blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. Flamethrowers and satchel charges are how they're going to get the Japanese out of these fighting holes. And that means you've got to maneuver infantry in the open, carrying high explosives, carrying napalm on your back, and move up to these holes and burn the Japanese out and then blast them with satchel charges if you hit them with the flamethrower. Blowtorch and corkscrew. So if you were a flamethrower man, you were a target. Very famous Medal of Honor recipient who's still with us today, a guy named Woody Williams, okay, famously took flamethrower after flamethrower and used it to great effect on Japanese position after Japanese position, single-handedly taking these groups out so that his squad could move forward. And he's still with us today, very alive and well, a hero in every sense of the word. Okay, so by 27 February, all three of these divisions are on the top of the airfield. The flag's been raised, and you can see the flamethrowers being used right here, napalm being used. Recently, I got a demonstration of a World War II, actual live demonstration of a World War II flamethrower, and I was standing from here to where the camera is in the back there, and you could feel the heat from that far away. I tell you, it was an amazing thing. And the flamethrower was not an easy weapon to use, and it was very dangerous to have it on your back. So, I should talk a little bit about the flag raisings because that seems to be interesting to people. And I always wonder, why were the flags even raised in the first place, and why was it important to get those Marines back to the United States so that they could be recognized as flag raisers? Because most of them, I would say, except for one, all of them really didn't want to be known. They didn't believe themselves to be very heroic because they raised the flag. They said the real heroes were dead on the battlefield. It wasn't them. And typical World War II vets, they would do that. Well, in this case, the first flag is going to be raised at 10:30 on D+4. It's a smaller flag, and this is the first flag raising right there. That Marine with the carbine in the front, I know who he is now. His name is J.R. Michaels, M-I-C-H-E-L-S, and the reason why I know is because we found his canteen cup at Camp Tarawa in an archaeological dig just a few years ago. And we were able to link that up with this guy. He passes away in 1986, the only son of a widow from Chicago, Illinois, who decides by 1944 he wants to get into the war before it's over. And 6 months later, he finds himself on top of Suribachi. What a place to be. Okay, but J.R. Michaels is that guy with the carbine right there. John Bradley, the corpsman, is one of those guys who raised this flag, hence the confusion of why they thought he was in the second flag raising. But it's raised at 10:30. Every Marine and every sailor that was there on the island noted it. Cheers went up from the fleet. Horns were blowing. Ships' bells were clanging. Marines were throwing their helmets up in the air, cheering because they knew that they wouldn't have to look at this mountain staring down their throats after this. Second flag raising is almost anticlimactic, but that's the most famous one because of the shot that's taken by AP photographer Joe Rosenthal. This is it. This flag is raised to replace the first flag 3 hours later. We have both of these flags in the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, Virginia. The first flag is in pristine condition because it only flew for 3 hours. The second flag is all tore up because it flew for weeks. But the second flag raising picture becomes the emblem of the 7th war bond drive. The push to get the final amount of money to win the war, to bring us across the finish line. And when this goes back to the United States, it goes in 1945 terms viral. Okay? It goes, every newspaper in the country is covering it, but you can't see the Marines' faces. You don't know who they are. An insurance executive from Chicago, Illinois, writes a telegram to Franklin Roosevelt, who's his friend, on the 25th of March and says, it would be really great if we could get the guys who raised this flag to come back and be with the flag when we do the war bond drive that we're going to kick off at Soldier Field on April the 20th, 1945. And Roosevelt sends him a telegram back 3 days later and says, great idea. I'll tell the Commandant of the Marine Corps to send these guys home, and we'll get them back here in time for the kickoff of the war bond drive. Well, here's a couple of things that intervene in the process. Roosevelt has exactly 10 more days to live. He's going to die of a cerebral hemorrhage on April the 12th, 1945. Harry Truman's going to become President of the United States after that. But also, there's confusion about who actually raised the flag, who was actually in this photo, because you can't see their faces. So they defer to PFC Rene Gagnon. And Rene Gagnon gets it wrong a couple of times. But he's honestly trying to figure out who it is, but he kind of guesses himself. And to this day, we had 3 boards now that can figure out, well, who actually raised that flag, and we think we finally got the right lineup. But I like the Commandant of the Marine Corps' answer when I presented him with this evidence just 3 years ago. I said, in reality, Rosenthal didn't care about who the flag raisers were because this was an iconic thing of all together now. The Marine Corps is in this. We're going to win this battle. And it's better that you didn't see their faces. And he goes, you're right. And he was quoted as saying it took 70,000 Marines on that island to raise that flag, not just 6 guys touching a pole. And that's really the truth of the matter. Here it is. First flag goes down. The second one goes up. It is not staged. If you go on the internet today, they say the Marine Corps staged the flag raisings. It's not true. There is a film that was filmed by a Marine Corps combat correspondent named Bill Janouse. He was a sergeant. He filmed the flag raising with a Brownie camera, 18 seconds, and you can see it go from the ground to perpendicular. Bill Janouse is still on the island. He was killed a couple weeks later in a cave. They've never recovered his body. There's about 90 Marines that are like that. There's Rosenthal taking the picture of the Marines after that second flag raising on Iwo Jima. Now, we got a lot of the flag raisers' faces from that picture, by the way. We can figure out who they are. But death was everywhere, and it was not easy. You can see a Japanese soldier at the bottom of that bomb crater, and they think he may be playing possum here because this Marine at the top is trying to convince him to surrender, but he's not sure if he's going to throw a grenade or shoot at him because oftentimes they would do that. So what is the offensive statistic for the Marine Corps? You can see them here. I won't belabor them, but they have essentially 2 2/3 divisions ashore by about D+4. Now that is fully 1/2 of all Marine combat strength in the Pacific for one battle. That's how bad it is. And they're going to take a lot of casualties as a result of that, but they're going to win the battle eventually. But 2 2/3 divisions are going to go ashore. To this day, the 3rd Marine Regiment was kept in floating reserve for the entire battle, was never landed. It never landed at Iwo Jima. It never landed at Okinawa. And for the life of me, I have no logical reason why they never used them. To this day, I don't know. I've asked everybody. I've done studies on it. I can't figure it out. An entire regiment of Marines don't go ashore. Why? I can't tell you. Okay, so some new developments during the battle. They were able to take out these defensive complexes using their blowtorch and corkscrew methodologies, but they were also able to do a lot of other things. One effective weapon used by the Marines at the time were tanks fitted with bulldozer blades that could literally carve away through Japanese defenses, or the highly valued flame tanks that could squirt napalm into cave bunkers and entrances at long distance. The Marines called these tanks Ronson lighters. So I don't think I wanted to be in one of those, but they called them Ronsons. And so it worked pretty effectively. So by early March of 1945, the Marines are starting to get the upper hand, but they still haven't cracked through Kuribayashi's main line. March the 1st, 1945 is a pretty bad day for the flag raising company, Easy 228. They're going to lose Sergeant Strank, one of the flag raisers. They're going to lose Corporal Harlan Block, one of the guys at the base of the flag. And a day later, they're going to use their battalion commander, Chandler Johnson, to artillery fire. So they're going to get hit pretty hard. Easy 228 is going to get pretty chopped up on March the 1st. Mortars, machine guns, and artillery are still taking a toll on the Marines. Iwo turns to a massive killing field for the Marine Corps by this time. The Marines closed in and took out Motoyama Airfield number 1, Motoyama Airfield number 2, and they broke through Nishi Ridge, they broke through the meat grinder, they broke through Turkey Knob, they broke through the amphitheater, they broke through all these positions at great cost. They said they would measure progress daily in yards. Literally, they said, we gained 100 yards today. And they'd lose half a company of Marines. And they'd gain 100 yards tomorrow, lose another company of Marines. Justice Chambers Battalion, 23rd Marine Regiment, he lost 40% of his Marines in the battle in the 4th Division. One company in the 5th Division lost over 50% of their men. That's 1 out of every 2 was killed or wounded severely in this battle. They said that in order for a unit to be effective in combat, if you reach 30% casualties, you're usually out of it. Marine casualties were averaging 50% casualties in every single unit. Every single unit. So March the 17th, 1945, the Marines feel they're starting to close in on the last Japanese airfield, and they're starting to get the upper hand. By the end of the battle, the Marines are going to have fought so hard that at least 22 Medal of Honor recipients are going to be recognized for this one campaign. Now, tell you how significant that is. In the entire Second World War, 22 MOHs represents 1/3 of all MOHs given to Marines for the entire war. So one battle, one campaign, 1/3 MOHs are going to be given to these Marines, many of them posthumously on this particular fight. What is Iwo's legacy? What is it? Why should we remember it today? Well, it's etched to our memory for a couple of reasons. Number one, it probably was the most violent fight from start to finish that the Marines had ever experienced. Every veteran I talked to, from Captain Fred Haynes to private first classes that were in the replacement drafts that I talked to in the last 10 to 15 years of interviewing them, would tell me that the sheer terror of being on Iwo Jima was something that can't replicate. And these were guys that had been in other campaigns. Ira Hayes, for instance, had been in 2 earlier campaigns. He had been in Cape Gloucester, and he had been in I believe, Guam. And so he had Cape Gloucester and Guam, and now he's in Iwo Jima. So he's on his 3rd campaign by Iwo Jima, and he was shocked by the carnage. He just couldn't get over how bad it was. The final pocket is going to be based at Kitano Point in the far northern end. Those of you who saw the movies that Clint Eastwood had done, the Flag of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi has kind of a last stand up there at the northern end of the island called Kitano Point. And the lessons learned are going to be that the Japanese are going to want to really bleed America if we have to come ashore on the home islands. That has been the real issue that we pick up on it. The Japanese are going to fight fanatically for every single inch of imperial territory. And this was considered imperial territory at the time, and they're going to do it very tough. So by the end of the battle, Kuribayashi's final headquarters is surrounded. It's a place called Bloody Gorge. The Marines are going to take it out once again through intense infantry fighting. It is an infantry fight from start to finish, close quarters, right up front, and there's no getting away from these guys. And one of the hardest lessons learned was that the Marine infantry had to realize that its supporting arms weren't going to be as effective as they had been in past battles because the Japanese were so heavily dug in. So it really had to be, you had to get right up to the cave entrances and hope they didn't shoot you before you shot them. Bill Janouse, the combat correspondent I told you that filmed the flag raising, was shot in one of those caves. A PFC was behind him with a satchel charge, and he told Sergeant Janouse, he says, I wouldn't go in there. And Sergeant Janouse says, nah, they've cleared this cave already. I want to see what's in here. So he takes a .45 pistol, he has a flashlight, and he runs into a Japanese soldier with an Arisaka rifle and puts a round right through his head. The PFC behind him shoots the Japanese soldier with his weapon, throws the satchel charge into the cave, collapses the entire cave, and that's why we don't know where Bill Janouse's body is today. That's the reason why. He's on Hill 362A somewhere, but we don't know where he is. I actually helped a group go back to try to find his body in 2008. It was a very wealthy man from Ohio that decided to sponsor an expedition. They went into several of these caves on Hill 362, and they stopped after 2 days because they were so dangerous that they were afraid that the rescuers would get entombed in one of these places. It was so scary to be inside these caves. So, on 26 March 1945, the Marines are basically winning. We used war dogs during this particular fight. They were very effective. Doberman pinchers could spell a Marine who was sleeping in a foxhole. And basically, Iwo Jima's applicability to today. Very important thing to understand. Okay, this right here, a rising China. Okay, we are running into the very same thing the Japanese did in World War II. They're trying to dominate the South China Sea. They're building man-made islands. They're looking for oil in East Africa. This is the very same situation that's happening today with China. Now, I'm not saying that there's going to be a war with China and the United States because I don't believe there will be. But on the other hand, some of the same variables are still out there. So that's why Iwo is applicable today. I talked to the Commandant of the Marine Corps about island hopping campaigns in the future. And he says that it's going to be very complex. Not going to be like the old days where you go ashore in waves. because they have too many precision-guided munitions that can take these out. But you'll come ashore in various ways, various different ways from far away, using V-22 Ospreys, or you'll use fast boats on the surface, or you may even use submersibles as well. But everybody's going to get ashore in a fundamentally different way than we did in 1945 because of the lethality of precision-guided munitions today. So one of the lessons learned of Iwo Jima is we can still do amphibious operations, but we have to be smart about it. We have to be smart about it. Requiem, 6,800 Marines killed, numbers of corpsmen and Navy personnel killed. One Coast Guardsman was killed during the battle. Army Air Corps lost about 44 men when the Japanese from Kitano Point broke through the Marines towards the last days of the fighting, killing and maiming about 44 airmen or pilots or air crewmen of the P-51 squadron that was flying raids off of Iwo Jima. The attack was stopped by a 5th Pioneer Battalion, which was a rear area kind of beach group that was led by a guy named Bauer, who led it. Oh, no, sorry, his name was Martin. And Martin led a counterattack with a pistol and a handful of grenades. Gets killed in the process, but stops the Japanese from killing more pilots. And he's awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. So they had the temporary cemeteries, 5th Division Cemetery, 4th Division Cemetery, 3rd Division Cemetery. In the 5th Division Cemetery is Medal of Honor recipient John Basilone, who had won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, but desperately wanted to get back in the fight and volunteered to go back in with the 5th Division in 1945. He said, I must be with my boys. And he took charge of a platoon. He was a platoon sergeant, and he's killed on the first day at Iwo Jima. I got his casualty card. And he's buried today in Raritan, New Jersey, in a cemetery that his family had selected for him. So this is a big deal to the Marine Corps. This fight has a lot of applicability today, but also etches its memory, its historical memory, in the essence of what it is to be a Marine. To have served in the Marine Corps or to have been in the Marine Corps, you will hear about Iwo Jima. The National War Memorial for the Marine Corps is located in Arlington, Virginia. It is a model that was done by Felix de Weldon. It is the Joe Rosenthal photograph made large with all Marine campaigns from 1775 to the present day. I had the honor of adding Iraq and Afghanistan just last year. Questions? So we'll stop here. We'll take some questions. Thank you. We have a roving microphone here.
Yeah. Dr. Neimeyer, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Quick reminder, you have some water behind you should you need it.
Okay, thank you.
But also the first guests to stay in the Higgins Hotel were the members of the 5th Marine Division 70th Reunion, and it consisted of 11 Iwo vets. So the hotel that Dr. Neimeyer is staying in, and hopefully you or your friends and family can stay in, it was sort of christened by heroes we just heard about this evening. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. We'll start in the center row about halfway back.
How has the experience at Iwo affected the tactics that the Marines use today?
That's a great question. What they do nowadays is that they practice amphibious operations, recognizing the importance of supporting arms to the overall operation. So the fact they didn't have enough supporting arms at Iwo Jima cost them a lot of casualties. So what they want to do is they want to be able to get artillery, they want to be able to get aviation, they want to be able to get a lot of assets ashore. So here's a classic example. The Marine Corps has heavily invested in the new Joint Strike Fighter F-35 Lightning Bravo variant, which is a jump jet variant. And the reason why they love this airplane is because the Marines said, when we make a landing, we don't have artillery yet. Those airplanes are our flying artillery. So therefore, that's the big thing that they've learned, is that in future operations, you need those supporting arms. That F-35 strike fighter is going to be a game changer.
Dr. Neimeyer, a follow-up here to your left from online. Dave is asking future amphibious operations. island hopping should be over, but have they learned lessons in today's Corps as far as the amphib operations of World War II and Iwo specifically?
I talked to the Commandant about this about a year ago, and we talked about it at length, and he said that in the future, we have this kind of assumption for the last 60 years that we don't have to worry about getting to the fight. And today, we're going to have to worry about that because of the ability of the bad guys to have smart weapons and precision guided munitions and artificial intelligence and drones and things like that. We're going to have to fight our way into the AOR, the area of operations. And so we're going to see what they call distributed ops in the future. They're going to be spread out, way spread out. Carrier battle groups are going to be very different in the next 10 to 15 years than you see just in the last couple of years. The carrier may be operating alone, where the destroyers and the cruisers are way far away, because the whole idea is you got to put space between you and these weapons, and you got to be able to interdict these weapons before they can get closer to our carriers or amphibious warships. So distributed operations are the wave of the future. They're still going to be using islands, and they're going to be taking islands, but it's going to be different the way we apply our ability to take these islands, and we're going to do it from spread out rather than combined together where it makes it too lucrative a target for you.
So we need new Higgins boats.
We need something like that. I say we need a really fast Higgins boat that goes on the water. Very low on the water, by the way.
Question in the back here, please. Shalita, can you stand?
Why did we give the island back to the Japanese?
Well, you can thank President James Earl Carter. But now, they gave it back to the Japanese because at the point we didn't have any military value because we had Okinawa. Okinawa still is a major location for U.S. forces. The 3rd Marine Division is still there, although we're pulling many of those forces off and putting them on Guam. We still have a pretty large component of Marines. I know some folks down here have a son that's there. I served 2 tours on Okinawa. It's referred to inside the Marine Corps as the Rock. And if you did time on the Rock, you remember it. So the Okinawa basically became our main base. It was much better strategically situated than the Bonin Islands that were kind of too far back. So it had no strategic value, and President Carter decided, well, we don't need it anymore. The Japanese wanted it back. One of the things we wanted to do, too, was the Japanese every year demand from the Russians the Kuro Islands. They took some islands north of Japan. It's called the Kuro Islands, that were traditionally Japanese islands for years. And when the Russians came into the war at the end of the Second World War, they took the Kuros and they kept them. Every year the Japanese asked for them back, and every year the Russians say no. So I think maybe President Carter was trying to say, well, we gave an island back, you guys can give this island back. And the Russians said, we're not doing that. So, sorry.
Near the middle here, center aisle. Stand up, please.
Do you think this battle had great effect or any effect on President Truman and his decision to drop the atomic bombs?
I have no doubt.
Yeah.
I think Iwo Jima and Okinawa was even worse. The casualties were worse in Okinawa because it was a longer campaign. But Iwo Jima and Okinawa convinced President Truman that the Japanese were going to fight fanatically for the home islands, and that I believe the estimates were 1 million U.S. casualties to take the islands, 7 million Japanese casualties, so 8 million dead to take the home islands. That was the estimate from the strategic planners. And Truman, in his memoirs, and I've read them, said that he didn't hesitate for a second when he was able to have the atomic bomb. He said, this may get me quicker, and while that's pretty horrific, it actually turns out it would save lives more than it killed. Unfortunately, for the poor people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was a horrific weapon to be used, and there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, Truman thought, as President of the United States, he couldn't justify losing 1 million Americans in invasion of the home islands.
Next question comes from Patricia online. Were the war dogs used during the battles on Iwo, or were they used as cleanup in the caves after the battle?
They were used from start to finish on Iwo. The war dogs were trained to be alert, and what they would typically do is that you would have a Marine and a war dog assigned, and the war dog would obviously stay alert, and the Marine could get sleep. And so the war dog would allow a Marine who was exhausted from day after day of fighting to have some sleep in a foxhole and not worry about getting his throat slit at night when the Japanese would do infiltration tactics. The Japanese were really good at that. They would come out of their caves at night, they would slither down to the Marine fighting holes, and they would try to get in there in the fighting holes with the Marines and kill them in hand-to-hand combat. I had a Marine just passed away. He was a survivor of Saipan, and he got attacked by a Japanese soldier in a hole one night, and he said it was something he'll never forget. He killed the Japanese soldier with an entrenching tool, but he said it was close, that he might have lost his life. He tried to get run through with a samurai sword, and he fought this guy for a good while before he was able to put him down. And he said, but that wasn't unusual. The Japanese were really, really fond of infiltrating and getting into those holes because they didn't have to worry about the machine guns and sporting arms. So they would come out at night, try to get into the holes with the Marines. And so the war dogs could warn you if somebody's approaching.
Center aisle here.
Looking back historically, in the 5 months remaining of the war, could you say that Iwo and the sacrifice made was worth the cost in terms of the base it operated, that it offered for the fighter squadrons and the B-29 squadrons?
There's a great book by a guy named Robert Burrell, and he argues that very question. He wrote it in 2008 or 2009. He says he's not sure if the cost was worth the reward of having this midway point. Could you have suppressed the Japanese with carrier strikes? But that would have meant you would have had to keep a fleet out there. And by this time, Iwo Jima, there was 2 kamikaze attacks against Navy ships at Iwo Jima. Both of them were successful strikes, killed a number of sailors. But kamikaze was starting to become more prevalent. And so one of the things the fleet was worried about, especially Spruance and Nimitz, were that the problem with taking these objectives or it ties the fleet down. You're hanging around this island and you can't get away, you can't move. I think one of the reasons why he does the raid on Tokyo is for that very reason, to avoid kamikazes. If you're moving, they can't really get you real well. So as a result, I think kamikaze was a factor in this thinking. But it's hard to say if it was worth it or not. I think it was. I think there's a number of airmen today who are alive that were, in fact, March the 3rd of 1945, the very first crippled B-29 makes an emergency landing. There's still 3 more weeks of fighting left to go on the island. It lands on Motoyama number 1, and the air crew gets out and thanks the Marines for having this airfield there because that meant they were going to live and they weren't going to have to ditch in the Pacific and get eaten by sharks. So as a result, I guess several thousand airmen were saved just from emergency landings alone. There's a lady right there.
Near the front here?
Yep.
Thank you. I've learned so much by affiliation with the museum and learning more about World War II after my dad survived, thank goodness, Iwo Jima with his brother, by the way. Very unique, I think, within the 4th Marine Division. But I was sort of nonplussed in learning about the Navajo code talkers.
Right.
And thrilled to know that they existed. But why on earth do we want to tell everybody about them when we had this wonderful resource and understood the Japanese could never crack the code?
Right.
Why do we give that away?
Well, we didn't give it, technically speaking, we didn't give it away until 1960. The Navajo Code Talker program was still classified until 1960. And in 1960, obviously the war is well over and people that kind of already knew about it. But it wasn't well known in 1945 about the Navajo Code Talkers. It was still relatively secret and had been kept under wraps fairly well. And as you said, the Japanese could not break that code. I got to meet the Code Talkers. There's Code Talker Hall at Quantico, Virginia. There's still a few left. They're an amazing group of people from Arizona mostly. They're incredible. What they did in the war, their contribution to the war was just unbelievable and extraordinarily brave. The Navajo tribe to this very day still has a strong relationship with the United States Marine Corps.
I was just wondering, have we been able to be sure that we bring in all our fallen brothers back from Iwo Jima? Or are we still looking for?
There are still 90 MIAs that were unaccounted for at Iwo Jima, Bill Janouse being one. Unfortunately, some that were killed in the surf got pulled out to sea and you don't find them. But now we recently uncovered some bodies that had been forgotten or left behind on Tarawa. In fact, one Medal of Honor recipient named Alexander Bonnyman was discovered in 2014, and I was indirectly part of this operation. It was a private organization that believed that they had a temporary cemetery that remained unmarked, and there was no headstones or crosses or anything. But a native had said there were some Marines still buried there, and they used ground-penetrating radar, and they located the graves of 35 U.S. Marines. And when I first told me about it, I said, ground-penetrating radar is a little bit inaccurate. I'm not so sure it would be them. But one of the general officers sent me back a forensic report on Alexander Bonnyman's body that they believed was him. And he had a complete intact skeletal remains. He had a dental record that matched it 22 points out of 22 points. So that's him. His body was returned to the United States after identification by the forensic folks in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and he was buried with honors at a cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee. But there are some still there. 90 MIAs from Okinawa, from Iwo Jima. Many of those Marines probably were killed in the surf and were pulled out to sea, and their bodies were not recovered.
Dr. Neimeyer, to your right, towards the back.
Why was it necessary to take Okinawa after Iwo Jima? Because both battles were obviously extremely costly, and was it really necessary?
Okinawa was a strategic target because the first, there was an operation that was planned. I think it's in the museum here. It's talked about. It's called Operation Downfall, and there are two phases to this operation. One was called Operation Cornet and Operation Olympic. And I think it was Olympic was the invasion of Kyushu Island towards the latter part of 1945. Now, Kyushu Island is the southernmost of the 4 Japanese islands, and Okinawa is south of that. So the idea was if we take Okinawa, we'll be able to base air power out of Okinawa airfields to hammer Kyushu while the invasion forces are going ashore, and it will give us an advantage to take Kyushu if downfall had to happen. Now, downfall does not come off because of the atomic bombs. But downfall was scheduled for late 45, Kyushu, and Honshu, the main island, the Tokyo Plain, was going to be attacked in early 1946. In fact, the United States Army was already sending divisions from the European theater to the Pacific to prepare for the landing on the main islands. And so many of these soldiers who said, well, we survived the Nazis just to get sent to the Pacific and get killed over there, they weren't happy about having to go over to the Pacific theater as well. Fortunately for them, the atomic bomb answered that for them and didn't have them have to do much in the Pacific at all.
We'll go to the front row here, to your right.
Thank you. Where were the Marines redeployed after Iwo Jima?
After Iwo Jima, the 5th Division went back to Camp Tarawa, the big island in Hawaii was where they went back to. That was where they staged out of. The 4th Division eventually made its way back to Camp Pendleton in California. Both of those divisions have been so decimated, they're not going to see another campaign for the rest of the war. They had lost so many men that there was no way they were going to get back. They were planning on using them after they rebuilt them in the 46 campaign on Honshu, but the 5th Division has one campaign in the entire war. That's Iwo Jima. And they had lost so many people, they couldn't use them again. The 4th Division was just as bad, and it would take them a year to recover, so they said that we're not going to be able to use them again. Okinawa wrecks the 6th Division and the 1st Division. So basically, the Marine Corps is running out of people. It has 6 combat divisions in World War II, 485,000 Marines, the largest the Marine Corps had ever been in its history, and literally 2/3 of the Marine Corps is knocked on its tail by Okinawa and Iwo Jima. So they had to get some new people in there, and they had to get replacements in there, and the veterans that went back to the States as well as Hawaii were getting replacements coming in for potential deployment in 46. Fortunately, they didn't have to deploy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Charles Neimeyer, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Neimeyer will be signing copies of his book over at the book signing table. I'd also like to draw your attention to the flyer tonight that's still on the table on your way out. Then we've got a lot of great programs, as you all know by now, but the next one you really want to pay attention to is the official book launch of Richard Frank's first volume in his trilogy on the Asia-Pacific Theater. Maybe the best title I've ever heard, Tower of Skulls. It covers the Asia-Pacific Theater from 1937 to 1942. That's March 3rd. So one last round of applause for Dr. Charles Neimeyer. Thank you all for coming out, and have a great and safe ride home.